Hello, this is John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University, and I'm an assistant professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. And this is an overview of my food fraud prevention presentation, how to start and how much is enough, for the Restaurant Loss Prevention and Security Association, RLPSA, annual conference here August 7th, 2018 in Dallas, Texas. First off, a real brief overview of our Michigan State program. We are educators, that's what we do, but there's a cycle here: outreach, research, education. So me interacting here and just even what I learned the night before and in the preparations really gave me some insight into the challenges and specific applications for loss prevention professionals and the industry in general. That's outreach. We gather information. We take that back and we do further research. And I did even research to begin looking at the topic itself. And that then can sometimes work into a grant or a paper, a research paper publication. And then that cycles back into education. Those are our graduate courses and the courses where we're really teaching there. And that content then does work back out to outreach, things that we present. So there's this ongoing cycle. And that's really what's happened with food fraud prevention. It's been an ongoing cycle. First off, the curriculum that we offer are free, emphasize free, free online, massive open online courses. We call these MOOCs. So we've got four of them that we offer now. One is an overview MOOC that's recorded twice a year but offered monthly on demand. We have a food fraud audit guide. So if you are being audited or you are doing audits, such as second party or third party audits, this is an option. This has been offered almost monthly now. We have a food defense audit guide. So this looks at the Food Safety Modernization Act, but also the GFSI requirements. And GFSI has been a real important aspect of this because the compliance requirements were as of January 1. And then we have a new training overall MOOC, a food fraud vulnerability assessment and prevention strategy development MOOC. And that's been offered in July and now offered monthly as well. So these are all basically 2-hour webinars, so they're short, but cover enough detail to really get started. And you can move along as you need. Feel free to forward this information to any of your colleagues, employees, suppliers, customers, and others. We have near infinite capacity. We also conduct executive education, so that could be on site, that could be usually at MSU. These are longer and really dig into the details of the strategy and implementation. And our graduate courses are all online. These are real Michigan State graduate courses, 3 credits. They're real work, and we have 6 of them that relate to food fraud in one way or another. Now, if you take 4 of those, then you can apply for a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention. This is really a demonstration that someone has taken the next step to really try to learn a broader foundation of insight to address food fraud. And then if the program is going well for you, you enjoy it, then the credits that you earn can be rolled into a Master's of Science in Food Safety. We also have in parallel a certificate in International Food Law. I'd like to take a moment just to thank our sponsors, our funders. We have a membership-driven food fraud think tank. These are brand owners and manufacturers. Dan and Mars, Cargill, Wegmans, Mondelez, Hershey's, and Woolworths from Australia. So really want to thank them. And their role is to really support our food fraud initiative mission and really to look at standardizing the prevention practices. And the deliverables that have come from that are expanded engagement, such as with Codex and ISO. This is real key because definitions are being codified, standards created around the world. So with this funding, we're able to attend those conferences and contribute. These audit guides, the food fraud MOOCs are really a part of that expanded programs, as is on-demand videos and access, such as this presentation being available on YouTube. We do reports and look at benchmarking as well. So thank you to them and their sponsorship. Just to let you know that on our website, there is more detail about our graduate certificate. And this is really just more detail if you need any more of that there. So what is food fraud? I think from a loss prevention perspective, this is something very new, but from a corporate security, protecting the brand, investigating crimes, this is a very common topic, but a lot of times it hasn't been organized under just a food fraud umbrella. So really, we need to step back and look at what is loss prevention before looking at what is food fraud in the application. So when we look at the agenda for the conference here, there's a lot more topics than just chasing down shoplifters and trying to catch employees who are stealing product. beyond just the retail location. Product coming in, product going out, it's product that's gone out and now outside your control. Beyond shoplifting and employee theft, and really, I'd say, and or corporate security. So the idea of loss prevention again is not just inside the retail store. It's looking at loss prevention across the entire supply chain of your product. Product coming in, product you might manufacture a bit, product that you use in the restaurant, and product that's going out. It's also broad, and we see a lot of insight and discussion about risk management. And this gets to the broader topic of enterprise risk management, which is a foundation of decision making for food fraud prevention. When we look at these control or prevention of product or sales losses, and I think that's expanding to look at product losses, not just sales. And we hear a lot of times that the loss prevention folks who are out in the field are doing audits such as food safety internal audits. So as you start to look at food fraud, this might be something that does expand, and we've got the training and resources to help with that. Oh, but the key is to look at this, but it's not everything. So loss prevention isn't getting dumped on for everything. The key is to look at the definitions and the scope to identify what is your responsibility and accountability and what's not. And it's not, your responsibility is not just everything. So during this presentation, consider your role and figure how this can and work through defining your accountability in the process. Again, one thing you can do is you forward this information. You can decide as a company what is your responsibility and what isn't, and that will help you refine your work focus. Supply chain vulnerability. So it's interesting dealing with restaurants compared to other types of manufacturers, brand owners, because there's sometimes, think about someone that's a co-op for a dairy. They're at the very beginning of the supply chain in that production stage, and the product then hands off several times by the time it gets to you as the restaurant, and as a restaurant, you serving it to the customer directly. They have a whole different set of vulnerabilities and challenges than you do. You also are relying on the entire supply chain to be trusted and trustworthy. So that puts an entirely different set of vulnerabilities and issues. We think a lot about incoming goods. So this is supplier quality assurance, making sure that product, you visited the plant and they're making good product. But there's also fraud that can occur in manufacturing. So that could be in a plant that's making, say, some type of mix for you. But that manufacturing, that HACCP program could be where product is being handled in the retail store, in the restaurant itself, where maybe some valuable spices are not put in, and those are stolen. That could be within manufacturing. And you've got finished goods going out. So this could be going to the table, but this could also be delivered. If you think about that through some of the delivery third-party groups that are delivering now, that's a whole different story. Also, some companies, some restaurants have product that's sold through grocery stores. Those brands could be in the US, they could be around the world as well. So that's beyond the retail store, but it's still absolutely the corporation. And then you've got technology transfer and contract manufacturing. So that could be, say, a restaurant chain that licenses their name to some company that then is using that to make frozen products. Also, contract manufacturing could be just people that are manufacturing outside. Consider this even to be franchisees. So those are people that are just a little bit outside of your direct control. You've also got product completely outside the supply chain, and it has been amazing to see what product has a brand name on it. So just because you would happen to be a restaurant or even a local regional restaurant, your product may be out in the marketplace with your name. One thing we also see is sometimes entire restaurants, especially in other countries, that have had counterfeit names of the restaurants or just near trademark violations. A key is that you're looking at the entire supply chain. And it's really important at the start when you're looking at vulnerabilities to look very, very broad. Now, when you do step back, all of a sudden there'll be a few things that maybe you didn't think of. Because when you look at the franchisees, some fraud that could occur there is maybe they're not buying some of that required ingredient through you. Maybe they're buying a cheaper version. Maybe they're diluting it in the marketplace before they sell it. You could also have things like donations or distressed goods. When it goes out the back door or just goes to someone, how do you know where it's going? And how do you know that it's being handled properly? There's been definitely issues where product was sent out that was supposed to be cooked at at a food kitchen or a food bank or something like that, and it was given out as frozen. Could be also just product that was supposed to be thrown in the dumpster, that someone does dumpster diving and takes that product out. Even if you watch product go to the actual dump and be put into the dump, if they're, say, cans, why wouldn't someone pick that up out of there? It looks like it's still good product. So our recommendation is to step back and look at the entire supply chain at least once, and really look through to take a methodical approach to look at where you may have vulnerabilities. The key is you look for vulnerabilities. If you don't find any, you document them, and then now you've done that assessment, you've had a documentation. You can't say it doesn't exist if you haven't even looked. So defining food fraud, the real simple definition is the illegal deception for economic gain using food. That's anything. It could be stolen goods. It could be the franchisees diluting it. It could be the donations that are then put back into commerce. It could be you buying what you think is a very high level Italian extra virgin olive oil that's actually not extra virgin or not Italian. So it could be product throughout the supply chain anywhere. It includes a subcategory of economically motivated adulteration. This is a U.S.-centric term that the U.S. defined, and it's a working definition of FDA, covers a substance for economic gain. Food fraud is a lot more than a substance. It could be any type of fraud, and as we've mentioned several times, distressed goods, spoiled goods, that's genuine product. Also, no substance has been added, and then the same with donations. Broad definition is consistent with really the major initiatives around the world. The motivation is economic gain, and this is different than food defense, where the motivation is harm or terror. The bad guys are trying to get away with it. They're just trying to cheat you. Now, there's always an economic threat, but there's not always a public health threat. And that's one reason why agencies such as US FDA haven't had a major focus on this, because they take a risk-based approach, a public health risk-based approach. A key is for you is there's always a vulnerability. There's always a vulnerability for that public health threat. That's where the real problem occurs. And so we step back and look at these vulnerabilities and try to put in place some, say, situational crime prevention, criminology theories to reduce you as a target. There's a lot of examples that we won't go into in detail here, but there's some there that we talk about if you like it. The key for you in loss prevention, we're trying to you get a clear direction. And by having the definition and clarifying this definition, you get a clear direction on what your task is or what your task isn't. The food risk matrix. This is an excellent way to look at all the risks that your organization is accountable to cover. So this is your CFO. And we heard a lot at the different sessions this year, people saying about bringing proposals to their CFO for the financial decision making. And so this is something that is on the radar of that level, and it's important to understand where your specific product fits into all food risks. Now, we've been dealing in food safety and food defense. Those are areas where we really knew. And the agencies, say FDA and others, have really been looking at these for that public health threat or that intentional threat. When we started to look at food fraud, we found that addressing the prevention aspect of it was fundamentally different than the other food risks. And we also found that food quality was there as well, because there's a lot of costs of product rework, expired goods, product just doesn't meet quality specifications. So these are all the food risks that affect a company. On the left-hand column, it's unintentional. You do not try to create those type of risks. On the right, it's intentional. The bad guys know what they're doing. A lot of times they're very smart and very sneaky, and they look at this complex supply chain to find where they can find a fraud opportunity. For food defense, we mentioned that the intent is harm, either public health, economic, or terror. And for food fraud, the motivation is economic gain for themselves. A disgruntled employee that's trying to harm you, that would be economic harm, not economic gain. It's a real important differentiator when we're looking at the root cause and really trying to understand the motivation. Now, we've heard a lot more in Europe about terrorism. So that is a subcategory of food defense. It's tricky to use the word terrorism because a lot of times a specific terrorist or terrorist act is defined by an agency such as US FBI, which would define it as an action by a known terrorist organization or someone affiliated with a terrorist organization. With that being the case, Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, although we would all consider that domestic terrorism and a terrible act, would not fall under the definition of terrorism. because he was not affiliated with a terrorist organization, at least not at that point. The intentional adulteration rule for FSMA covers wide-scale harm, so they go broader than that. But they're not looking at that, disgruntled employee that's just trying to hurt the store manager. You need to worry about all food defense, and the key with things like the GFSI-related compliance requirements, such as SQF, BRC, FSSC, IFS, and others, the food safety requirements require you to look at all food defense. So under food fraud, economically motivated adulteration is a subcategory that's just adulterant substances. This is a great way to look at all those food risks and figure out exactly what we're talking about, get into detail. So I'm really excited to be here with loss prevention professionals because we have a lot more criminologists and people that study crime. So we'll step back and go into a little bit more detail than we often do, looking at the crime science aspect of this. The real root is situational crime prevention, target hardening. We're trying to make the space of crime tougher for the bad guy to commit an act. And what we do here is we look overall to focus on the motivation. And you may remember this from your criminology degrees, but this is the fraud opportunity and the crime triangle: victim, fraudster, guardian, hurdle, gaps. This is how we focus on the motivation. We deconstruct to understand what's going on and why they perceive that they can get away with this. We look at factors that lead to system weaknesses. So if a fraud event occurs, an act occurs, a crime occurs, there's some type of weakness. Or it may be a strength of yours, but the bad guy didn't perceive it as a strength. So what we do in that case is we try to make them more aware that there's a good chance that they would get caught. And there's a progression here. Detect. We need to detect a crime before we can really act on it. Deter is the next step, where we understand exactly how and why someone is attacking. We put controls in place to try to minimize that or increase their risk of getting caught. But overall, prevention is the goal. So even if an act hasn't occurred, if we look at the system, we may be able to find a weakness. Something that's happening maybe happened elsewhere, maybe happened in a different industry, but some type of weakness. Now, what we want to do is put in control measures that reduce that vulnerability. So to go into situational crime prevention just a little bit more, we'll just review some of the basics. So criminology is not a new science, but it's new to food protection. And what we've done is we really look to step back and begin with product management and then apply the theory. And each product has unique specialized science and market issues. So every product you buy, even two restaurants that look almost exactly the same, they may have very different fundamental food fraud opportunities because of the way they operate, pursue, review, hire employees, and things like that. Next, looking at situational crime prevention itself, the science is defined by implementing opportunity-reducing measures that, key here, are directed at highly specific forms of crime. So we have already defined food fraud, such as dilution by franchisees or theft of distressed product, off-spec product that's been thrown away. It's a specific form of crime. Second, involve management, design, or manipulation of the immediate environment in as systematic and permanent way as possible. Again, here, this is exactly what we're doing. We're looking at ways that maybe that distressed product, the cans get crushed before they go in the dumpster. Then that would be very permanent as an implementation. Third, make crime more difficult or risky and less rewarding as judged by a wide range of offenders. A key is we don't really look at the morals and ethics of it. We just want to reduce the fraud opportunity so that someone looking at a restaurant does not see a chance to conduct that fraud act. Then finally, there's four components of situational crime prevention. First is theoretical foundation. So that's what we're doing. We're studying the crime. We're having this foundation. It's based on routine activity. So some routine activity theory is that criminals look for opportunities in their routine activities. So that could be someone that's looking at your restaurant, works there, delivers to you. And second is rational choice. So a key with that is they think they're making a rational choice that they can get away with this crime. They don't commit the crime thinking they're going to get caught. So there might be some factors that they're not aware of that we can more emphasize. Second is standard methodology based on the action research paradigms. Action research is we review, we test, we implement, we review again, and we continue to do that. That's what we're doing. Set of opportunity reducing techniques. So when we look at food fraud, when we start to look at, say, how you procure product, there's certain best practices about testing product along the supply chain, different types of tests to conduct authenticity, weights, things like that. And fourth, the body of evaluated practice, including studies of crime displacement. Key is we're not quite there yet. There is a lot of research starting down this path, but we're really getting the point, we're at the point where we're defining the term and defining the actions. Later, I think we'll have a lot more of that empirical research looking at the body of evidence. So what do you have to do? What needs to be in place? You might not be aware, but every restaurant has a food safety management system of some kind, some type of certification. So again, if you're in loss prevention, your team is probably doing some of those audits. Maybe you're doing some of those food safety audits, those kind of internal audits. But one of the programs is SQF, and this is a food safety management system. So they just had their new update about a year ago. It's called a GFSI recognized scheme or certification program. So the Global Food Safety Initiative is a group of brand owners, restaurants included. So major international restaurants are on the board of directors to set the food safety program. GFSI then endorses or recognizes the different standards. So SQF seeks and receives the recognition and approval that they meet GFSI's overall fundamentals. The terminology is shifting. They've been calling it schemes, but they're shifting to certification program or standard. They published their document in April 2017, so this should not be a surprise. So it's been over a year that's been announced that food fraud was a requirement. It's required as of January 1, and a key is looking at the definition of food fraud. It's important to look at the scope. All fraud, all types of fraud, all types of products. That could be those stolen goods. It could be distressed product going out. It could be spices coming in. All products are under this scope. Now, don't worry. I mean, when we look at the process, it's very, very simple as we start to look at the overall system. But a key is you need to understand what are those requirements right here at the start. To look in just real quick in detail what SQF's looking for, because what we can do here is it looks like it's a lot, but when you really boil it down, the first steps are very simple, and the requirements are not that intense, at least at the start. So they do have a section on food fraud. A key emphasis all throughout is underlined of vulnerability to food fraud. That assessment shall be documented. Doesn't say how long it is, doesn't say how many data points, doesn't say how many hours you took, how many pages long, just that you have one. That vulnerability shall include the site's susceptibility. Now, this is a corporation-wide, so you could have an overall fraud assessment for your corporation. And then if there's any specific special practices at the sites, those would be noted as well. But if all of your sites are exactly the same, purchased the same way, have the same profiles, then you could have one vulnerability assessment, even if you have 1,000 restaurants. A food fraud mitigation plan. Again, this could be corporate level, as long as the stores confirm that they're implementing it. It's an overall prevention strategy or mitigation plan. And it addresses those vulnerabilities that you just identified. You'll conduct this at least annually, and records of the reviews of the plan shall be maintained. So you have to have records. An auditor might say, can I see your vulnerability assessment? You need to be able to show it. And the key is that's at the site. What we see some people do is have talking points, or if you have a binder for audits with the food safety plan, you can just put that in there. Overall, what we see is that an overall risk management system, there's some type of vulnerability assessment, food fraud vulnerability assessment. There's some type of prevention strategy, and then there's some details. So whatever the standard is, even if it's just basic ISO 9000 quality management, there's an assessment, there's a strategy, and then some details required. So build that overall system and then adjust it to the specific standards or requirements that you have. A key is, with all of this, you get clear direction. Clear direction on what you're accountable for and what you're not. And partially here, by identifying what you're not accountable for, that will identify and alert other people that other people are accountable for other aspects of this. So how to start? We look at really reviewing current projects and just write it on a whiteboard. And what we see here is there's a lot of different programs probably in place. They came up for food safety, physical security, a certain incident, some type of concern, but there's not an overall holistic strategy for food fraud. And so we start with, all we're doing is summarizing everything that you're already doing into the strategy. Now, when we put these together, we might be able to identify where there's a gap. And if there's a gap, it usually does show up. So that's just the first start. It's just real basic organizing, looking at it through, let's say, a food fraud lens, looking at it from that food fraud perspective. Just to give you an overview of some of the implementation of what's been out there, and that this is not just academic theory from our end. Wegmans is one of our food fraud think tank, one of our early members there, and Wegmans presented at the Food Safety Summit regarding GFSI. Wegmans also on the GFSI board, and kind of along your lines is they have a lot of buffet and quick serve restaurants inside their stores. So there's a lot of this that's already been in place. You may have, you're not buying as many products, so you can have some lessons learned here. So in the Wegmans presentation of their food fraud prevention strategy, the first thing that they point out is a methodical approach. So you see a cycle here. Now, we didn't get into the cycle in our presentation. We've got plenty of it online. But a key is they have a way to look at this action research paradigm, the criminology theories. Assess new information, look at that opportunity, digest it, conduct the vulnerability assessments, plot that on a corporate risk map so you know what is a problem, what isn't, look at countermeasures, and cycle again. And the key here is there's already a cycle in place. And so when people like Wegmans are talking about this publicly, you can see that these things are implemented. Next is looking at the overall approach for them. Now, one thing, they've been involved with us at Michigan State for a while, but a key that I wanted to point out is the process from 2 to 10, which is how they're implementing it. Very simple. Convene a task force, just a group to look at it, start talking about it. Conduct training and background. Part of it could be this webinar to just look at the education. Look at what your overall policy and strategies talk about. Protecting customers, having legal product. Conduct a real simple assessment first, and then go into details with a more detailed vulnerability assessment only as you need. Sometimes broad groups of maybe 90% of products could be identified as a very low. You wouldn't need to go that much deeper. And then you look at them in a risk map against all other risks. The key is we're not looking at food fraud in relation to food fraud. We're looking at food fraud vulnerabilities and risks in relation to all enterprise risks. So there might be a lot of food fraud vulnerabilities you identify, but they may be so low compared to your overall corporate risk tolerance, risk mitigation plans, that the action is really to monitor. At the same time, you may feel that they're very low, but when you compare those risks to enterprise-wide, what could be a problem, then they could end up being astronomical. This is not looking at it as an operational risk of just how many cases did you lose, but if those cases get lost, get online, there could be real brand damage equity for your corporation. And then really looking at the continuous monitoring and implementing the actual strategy itself. And we see companies only recently, many companies are now implementing rigorous and thorough food fraud prevention strategies. It does not mean it's a big group or a lot of activities. It's just that there's a formal plan in place. So how much is enough? Really, you need to start by defining the goal and your starting point. And the real key starting point is meeting regulatory compliance or certification type compliance, such as the food safety management systems. So by reviewing these and going into detail specifically into GFSI, we've laid out a set of questions. So if you can answer yes to all these questions, then congratulations, you're in about the 5% of all companies that have thoroughly implemented food fraud. But if not, we've helped scope out kind of where there's gaps. This has all been published these are blog posts, trade journals, and others. First off, conduct a food fraud vulnerability assessment, yes or no. So have you conducted one at all? Is it written? Now, the key with that was an auditor's, could you show me? How soon can you show me? Now, I can't just take your word that you've done it. I need to be able to see it so that I can document that you do pass. Implement a food fraud prevention strategy. Is it documented? So I would ask you, can you show me your food fraud prevention strategy? And a lot of people say, oh, yeah, we have one. Oh, but it's not written. Well, then, as an auditor, that's something that you can't see, you can't confirm it. Also, even internal reviews, compliance, identification of roles and responsibilities. You as loss prevention or you as corporate security, you want a food fraud prevention strategy for your company to be implemented. Because once you read it, you can see clearly, again, what your role is and what your role isn't. And that's a real key. Sometimes there's an assumption that corporate security is handling all this. So that's a real key of having this written. Minimally conduct an annual food fraud incident review. So if you just did one, then that's a yes. These last two are the ones that are really a challenge for people. One is that it covers all types of fraud. So you might have like an employee theft assessment. You might have a cargo theft assessment or supplier quality assurance, but not for all types of fraud. And that's a real key. And this is really important because this is your brand, your corporate brand equity that's really being protected. And the last question is address all products, both incoming goods, that would be ingredients, outgoing goods, finished goods, all the way through to the consumer. Now you're handing product to the consumer, so you have that end of it. But what about farther up the supply chain? Now, if you're doing retail store security, physical security, then there's a lot of things that are outside your control. But again, if you're more broad and more strategic, more corporate, then those are things that aren't under your control. And there's the references and links there. So just to conclude, the conclusion for you. The compliance date. So just to step back, the GFSI requirements were January 2018. So it's now August. So it was 7 months ago that it was required. And we do see companies that have had failed audits, audit nonconformance for not addressing food fraud. The requirement is a vulnerability assessment for all fraud and a prevention strategy for all products. Now, this really shouldn't be a surprise, but no documents, no audit nonconformance. So you've got to have it documented. Like, it doesn't mean to me that there's a lot of documentation, but at least a way to present to me your vulnerability assessment and your prevention strategy. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise to people because, as you noted, SQF announced this in April of 2017, so over a year ago. And then actually some of the standards have had parts of this required all the way back to 2015. GFSI itself identified this as a need in 2014 and defined that it would be implemented. Then the Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, this is a lot of the product through the supply chain, not the restaurants themselves, but an assessment was really required in 2016. And what's written in FSMA is the hazard analysis must be written regardless of its outcome. A key is you can't say that, donation product in the marketplace is not a health hazard or a hazard or a risk to your company unless you've conducted an assessment. Now, you may do a real quick, short assessment to figure out it's not a problem, but you need to have an assessment. And for the Food Safety Modernization Act, this is required. And in there, it also does specify the hazard may be intentionally introduced for purposes of economic gain. So that's non-traditional in a lot of ways, but this has been in FSMA since the very start. So again, this should not be a surprise to people. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, so this was implemented in 1938. All types of food fraud have been illegal, whether it's for manufacturers, producers, or restaurants, has been illegal at least since 1938. So it's really been there. Now, something we don't usually think about is Sarbanes-Oxley. So Sarbanes-Oxley was required in 2002 and then again in 2007 expanded, but this looks at requirements for brand equity and potential impacts on revenue. So if you're a public company in the U.S., this is required. If you're a private company or you're outside the U.S., your board of directors still does have some type of oversight for your owners. Again, why do all this? So you get clear direction. What is your role and what is not your role? And as we said before, too, is that a lot of times without much clarity, there's an expectations that supplier quality assurance handles everything internally, corporate security loss prevention handles everything externally. So really important to take a look at this. Call to action, again, you get clear direction. Ask if food fraud's being addressed. Ask about food safety certification. What is that standard? Anything with FSMA, FDA, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Actually ask also about enterprise risk and Sarbanes-Oxley, if this should be included in there. It's really excellent to have it in there because that really helps with calibration of really looking at the risk tolerance. The second major point is consider your role and responsibility. I guess I've said this over and over again, so it's not really a new idea of what is your responsibility and what isn't. But really, we see that loss prevention is a lot more than employee and retail location theft. There could be more things like that employee dilution or substitution. That's something we haven't really thought about. And also then we've already started discussions of what's the next step for RLPSA, different types of webinars, this content, fact sheets, workshops. I'd say from our end at Michigan State, we're at your service. So please connect with us either through the association or your companies directly. There's a lot of ways to engage with us. Please see our website, foodfraud.msu.edu. We have our massive open online courses almost monthly. Those are free content, so that's a great way to start. And we have a lot of support services if you need more. A lot of people to thank. Really thankful, grateful for the organizers of the conference here to invite me, and the support that we've had along the way has been excellent. I look forward to working more closely with you. With that, we'll take questions. Thank you.